We've got a fantastic guest joining us now. It's Dave DeCamp. He's Dave DeCamp. He's editor, news editor at antiwar.com, which is a very important resource, actually, for our channel when we're doing our investigative journalism. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks for having me on.
Mate, you said that that you were interested in the story that former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that the US blocked his efforts of mediating peace between Russia and Ukraine. It's a story you reported on that hasn't been picked up much. Why is that? Do you think that there was a potential peace that has been blocked, and what would be the reasons for that, mate?
Yeah, so this is a pretty huge story. So Naftali Bennett, he was the Prime Minister of Israel when war first broke out, when Russia first invaded, and he took his role to be a mediator, and he actually went and visited Putin on March 4th. So that's less than a week after, the invasion, and things really, were heating up. And in this interview that he just posted on his YouTube channel over the weekend, he really detailed his mediation efforts. And he said he met with Putin on March 4th. He called Zelensky right away. He was talking to them back and forth. And he said he coordinated the entire thing with the US, the UK, the German, and the French. And he said there was real will on both Putin's side and Zelensky's side to reach a ceasefire. He said he got major concessions out of them. Putin dropped his demand of the denazification of Ukraine, which he defined as removing, basically regime change, removing Zelensky. And he said Putin also dropped the demand of demilitarization. On Zelensky's side, he said that he renounced trying to join NATO, which this is Bennett, former Israeli prime minister, explained was the reason for the Russian invasion, was how close Ukraine was to NATO. But Bennett said, again, he coordinated this with all these Western countries, and he told the interviewer that there was a decision among the Western countries that they wanted to keep striking Putin, how he put it. This is translation from Hebrew. And he said, he was asked, did they block the talks? And he said, yes, they blocked my efforts. And that wasn't the last attempt at peace between Russia and Ukraine. Again, this is March 2022. Fast forward a few weeks, Russian and Ukrainian officials met in Istanbul, and they came close to a deal, according to a lot of reports. And then a few weeks later, Boris Johnson visited Kiev, and according to his own office, he urged Zelensky not to negotiate. Reporting in Ukrainian media, Ukrainska Pravda, said that he said, even if you're ready to sign a deal with Putin, we are not. And he was speaking for the collective West. So they stopped this war. They stopped the negotiations. They wanted to continue the war. Turkey, the host of those Istanbul talks, said that they thought the war was going to end, but some of their NATO partners wanted to continue the war to weaken Russia. And then just a few days later, again, this is April 2022, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, former Raytheon board member, came out and said, we want to weaken Russia in Ukraine. So it's just more evidence that the U.S. and its allies blocked negotiations at the beginning of the war and wanted this thing to continue.
Even if we don't become ensnared in the broader morality of inciting war when peace is available, we surely have to address the way that the media has reported on this conflict, denying most people access to the details that you just inventoried. We've focused on several fascinating aspects of this story, notably the profiteering of the military-industrial complex, and more recently, BlackRock's investment in the reconstruction of Ukraine. If you could just talk a little about that for a moment, Dave, then we'll move on to an even broader geopolitical narrative that involves unipolar incentives and ongoing American hegemony and the likely forthcoming conflicts between the United States and China, especially if they keep sending those terrifying balloons. But first, can we talk about their reconstruction and the investment opportunities that's offering American corporations in particular?
Yeah, sure. So the clear winner right now of continuing this war to weaken Russia is Raytheon, Boeing, the weapons makers, the American military industrial complex, the $100 billion, much of that is going to them. And it's not just that. European countries are sending their old, Eastern Europe, former Soviet republics. They're getting rid of their old Russian-made weapons, buying some new shiny American weapons. They're really making a killing. But as you have been covering a lot, the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to have a huge price tag. The World Bank estimated in December that it would cost between 500 and 600 billion to reconstruct Ukraine. Zelensky put it at 750 billion. That was a few months back. As the war goes on, more people are being killed. The country is being destroyed. That price tag is going to go up. And that's where you see these companies like BlackRock. They're going to get in on this reconstruction, and they're going to be able to create all this new infrastructure because Russia has been destroying the infrastructure starting in October. As the war has continued, it's just going to get worse and worse for the people of Ukraine. And that, 600 billion that it's going to cost, or 750 billion, might even get up to $1 trillion. That money is going to be loaned. There's going to be interest payments. There's going to be grants from the governments that are backed by central banks so they can just print money. I mean, it almost makes the 100 billion seem small, the amount that they're going to be able to make off of Ukraine's reconstruction. And unfortunately for the people of Ukraine, they're the ones that are suffering right now, dealing with rolling blackouts and not being able to heat their homes, in the harsh Ukrainian winter.
Not to mention that the conditions in Ukraine economically will likely be favorable to a great many globalist imperatives. We talked about in our presentation just there the opportunity to create a 100% digital state, and that was not conjecture. The Ukraine themselves have produced a piece of publicity material, video in particular, outlining a vision that you can have an entirely centralized surveillance state with biometrics, deeply immersive ability to observe. So there's the profit for the military-industrial complex, there's the reconstruction profit, and there's the kind of opportunity to turn Ukraine into a pilot state for numerous imperatives that have been discussed openly over the last 5-6 years around digital ID, social credit scoring, even more enhanced surveillance techniques. So it's very easy to see how there is an agenda alongside the obvious humanitarian agenda that elsewhere in geopolitical history has not seemed to be at the forefront of corporatist American interests.
Yeah. And a big part of this, too, is about, with all those companies building the infrastructure, and besides just turning Ukraine into a de facto NATO member, which I think it's pretty fair to say they are now, as Reznikov has said, the defense minister who's being replaced, giving them this foothold in Ukraine right on Russia's border to turn it basically into this Western client state right in Russia's backyard, I think was a big part of the goal, a big part of the reason why the U.S. kept pushing this and was involved in Ukraine, going back to the 2014 coup and supporting Ukraine in the war in the eastern Donbass region through all that time. There was reporting right before Russia's recent invasion, not recent, it's been almost a year now, but there was reporting from Yahoo News that CIA paramilitary officers were deployed on the front lines of the Donbass war, during that whole time. So again, you talk about the narrative, it's a snapshot for the corporate media from February 24th until now. For us, we have to look at the big picture. It even goes beyond way back before 2014 with NATO expansion and all that. So that's why people are buying up this narrative, because, again, they give them that snapshot.
Not to mention the Nord Stream pipeline and the shift now in Americans' ability to sell resources across the world, which was another explicitly stated goal prior to the commencement of this conflict. We want to be the #1 provider of liquid gas, which I believe is another one of the objectives that has been subsequently met. It helps us, doesn't it, Dave, to see geopolitics in the form of a broader narrative, in particular the attempt to destabilize Russia, potentially because of a burgeoning partnership and set of treaties that they've cultivated with China. Now, of course, America's, every time I say China, I want to say China. Their relationship with China is, of course, in the headlines because of that terrifying, awful, bloody balloon. But also, there is a wider global narrative about U.S. hegemony and unipolar intentions and the potential for China and Russia to disrupt that. Are we likely to see this story becoming increasingly incendiary over coming weeks, months, years, Dave?
Yeah. And, one point is that the people running American foreign policy, the neocons who control it and other people, part of the deep state, there's different factions, and some of them are not very smart. And those are the ones right now that are controlling the Biden administration. I think, Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, what they're doing to Russia and China clearly is going to bring them closer together. They're both facing Western sanctions. They're both facing Western military buildups. And now they're shaking hands and making deals. And it's creating this kind of new, like you said, multipolar world potentially with Russia, China, Iran, even Venezuela, all these countries that are being sanctioned by the U.S. They're kind of creating this enemy. And we know that, just look at the history of the U.S. foreign policy. They've done this before. They opened up China and got all this industry there and really built them up. And now over the past few years, China has really become the boogeyman. So now there's a lot to this China thing in the balloon. And right now, what people have to do is just stop for a moment and not get kind of whipped up into a frenzy about this scary Chinese spy balloon that went over the U.S. You really have to ask questions. And the big thing, I think, is that so China says it's a weather balloon. The U.S. says it's a spy balloon. China says it accidentally drifted over the U.S. Who knows? It's not exactly clear. Then you have the Pentagon saying this has happened before. And one thing I pointed out in my article that I wrote up about it, it's on antiwar.com today, is that just a few years ago, surveillance aircraft from a foreign country over the U.S. wouldn't really be that big of a deal because the U.S. and Russia had a treaty called Open Skies, and it allowed unarmed surveillance flights over each other's territory. Trump pulled out of it in 2020. Russia actually tried to salvage it, but the Biden administration rejected the offer. That was another thing that led up to this war is the decline of arms control treaties between the U.S. and Russia. So anyway, so maybe a balloon floating over the U.S. for a little while wouldn't have really raised alarms back then before this treaty was scrapped. I'm not really sure, but we have to ask these questions. And the timing of this whole balloon thing, the Pentagon announcing it right before Blinken is supposed to go to China. And Blinken cancels his trip. And it shows what a pathetic diplomat he is. Right now, what he should be doing is, there's a balloon. This could be an issue between the U.S. and China. I got to get on the phone. I got to get over there and talk to them about this. But no, of course, he cancels the trip. When it comes to Russia, Blinken has totally failed as a diplomat. Since Russia invaded, you would think if you're the top diplomat in the United States, you would try to be talking to Russia every day to stop this war. But nope, he cut off communication with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. They only spoke one time that we know of, at least, since Russia invaded, and that was to discuss a prisoner swap. So he's a totally failed diplomat. But I think that might have something to do with the timing of the announcement by the Pentagon. Of course, also people did just see it. They looked up and saw it. So who knows if the previous ones were that visible. But this is against the backdrop of this U.S. military buildup in the Asia Pacific. Just last week, the U.S. announced it's opening 4 new military facilities in the Philippines. The week before that, the U.S. Marine Corps opened a new base on Guam. And these Marine leaders, these military leaders in the Asia Pacific, they say they're doing this to prepare for war with China. Just a few weeks back, the top U.S. Marine Corps commander in Japan told Financial Times that they're increasing cooperation with Japan, the Philippines. We're doing this. We call it setting the theater as we set the theater in Ukraine after 2014, comparing it directly to that war. And now with Taiwan, of course, is the big one. If you remember last summer, Nancy Pelosi's little stunt, she went over there and it provoked the largest Chinese military drills around Taiwan that have ever happened. They fired missiles over the island. They simulated a blockade. They never did that before. It was clear China was going to react like that. She went anyway. And now we have Kevin McCarthy, the new House Speaker. He's saying he's going to go too. And Taiwan's a tricky one because a lot of people don't understand the situation. But since 1979, the U.S. has not had diplomatic relations with Taiwan. That was how they opened up with China. It's the foundation of U.S.-China relations, is kind of this weird scenario. And you could go back further. U.S. intervention in the Chinese Civil War, backing Chiang Kai-shek when the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan. The U.S. intervening militarily in the 1950s to stop Mao from trying to take Taiwan. All this stuff is very important that people need to understand. But right now, what we've seen in the past few years, starting really under the Trump administration, is that they're changing the relationship from Taiwan. It used to be kind of an issue between the U.S. and China, and now they're using it as an opportunity to kind of poke China. And, these visits, Nancy Pelosi going over there is a big deal because she was the Speaker of the House, and that China views that as an affront to the one China policy. the U.S. has been selling them more weapons. The National Defense Authorization Act, the 2023 military spending bill that Biden just signed, include military aid for Taiwan for the first time ever. They've always sold them weapons. They've never financed the purchase. And China reacted, more drills around Taiwan. They're telling us, if you keep doing this, this could lead to war between the U.S. and China. They're telling us outright, but they're not listening. So it's going to be a similar situation where the U.S. is going to potentially provoke a war over Taiwan. And just like the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and China cannot go to war. China doesn't have nearly as many nukes as Russia and the U.S. do, but they still have plenty to destroy the world if there was a nuclear exchange. And the narrative, if you see people telling you that Joe Biden is owned by China, that's just a false narrative because, yes, Hunter Biden made some money over there. But if you paid attention to Biden's foreign policy, he's been tougher on China than Trump was. He's increased all these sanctions, trying to cripple their semiconductor industry. And not just U.S. sanctions, they're trying to get the Netherlands and Japan to get in on these sanctions. And again, these military buildups. And his Pentagon, his State Department, the CIA, the FBI, just about every federal agency under Biden has said China is our number one threat, our top enemy. So we have to think very cautiously about all this balloon frenzy when that is the backdrop. That's the situation we're in today. U.S.-China relations are so low.
Seems like there is an aggressive agenda being subversively deployed almost uniformly and continually, whether it's this current conflict and its preceding provocations, or what we appear to be seeing now is kind of comparable to the gradual encroachment around territories that have associations with China, the building of a narrative that there is a necessity for a conflict. I suppose that what we will look out for over the next 6 months to a year is like, oh, Taiwan, there's this humanitarian crisis. We've got to help these Taiwanese people. They're doing their best. China's invaded. Or we'll be invited to forget the provocation. What dear Blinken, if he's any kind of a diplomat, should be doing is getting himself on a balloon and going to China by balloon on a global balloon tour for peace. That is the sort of diplomatic opportunity that ought to be embraced. Dave, thank you for describing these complex events in such an accessible, thoughtful, and I would say inclusive way. Antiwar.com has, as I understand it, no left-right political bias. What is the agenda of antiwar.com? Is there any clues in the name, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, that's basically our bias, is that we're anti-war, non-interventionist. We're a libertarian staff, so we're what most people would consider, right-leaning. But we have columnists from all over the political spectrum, and that's been the mission of the website. It was founded in 1995 by Eric Garris and Justin Raimondo. And Justin was the columnist who was a genius, but unfortunately he passed away in 2019. But the whole time it was about building a coalition. We would run columns from, Daniel Ellsberg and Pat Buchanan, just completely different ends of the political spectrum. And we still do that today. And that's what we pride ourselves on. Because, this issue, especially now, as we're looking down the barrel of a potential war with Russia and China now, a nuclear war, we really need to unite to stop this. And that's what we're all about. And the site is entirely reader funded. That's why they've been able to do this and go against these narratives. And I'm very honored to be working for them. I started doing it full time in 2020. And I just write short news articles every day. I sort through hundreds of articles in the mainstream media every day and kind of filter it through to give people a short understanding. So that's what we're about. And again, I think your viewers, would appreciate what we do over there. And also, if people don't want to read, I condense it into about a 30-minute daily podcast. It's called Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. You can listen to the audio version, or we also have a YouTube channel. We're also on Rumble and all that stuff. So yeah, I think, our views align a lot, Russell, in that politics are kind of secondary when we're in the situation we are today, and people really need to wake up. And I know you had Jimmy Dore on promoting that anti-war rally February 19th in Washington, D.C. We're going to be represented there by Scott Horton, who's our editorial director. He's a human encyclopedia. People are familiar with him. But yeah, so that's what we're about.
We're going to be represented at that march by Gareth, who's a human centipede here, very much like that terrifying film where people did all manner of filthy stuff. Yeah, in a way, true opposition these days has to be bipartisan and transcendent of those kind of divisions, because it's quite clear that centralist interests, whether left or right, both have a pro-military agenda, both pro-surveillance, both pro-digitization, and really what is required is a coalition of the awakening in order to truly oppose what appears to be a relentless march towards the apocalypse. I mean, when we're in the Armageddon, we won't have time to check what rosettes the other zombies are wearing as we pick through the ashes and rumble. This is a Democrat zombie. This one's a Republican zombie. Let's just get on with some new, transcendent, truly democratic populist movement that embraces freedom from across the political spectrum. So I think Dave's told you a great deal about antiwar.com. I know that Gareth and the rest of the team use your resources quite a lot in generating the narratives we use for our content, although to be honest most of the work is just done by me on the spot, because I just improvise news myself. I just come up with stories, just, you know, it's all up there under one of my elaborate hats. Dave, thank you so much, mate, for joining us. Thanks for your brilliant work today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Russell, again, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You've got a kind, wonderful face of a Christ-like figure, Dave, isn't he? Dave, thanks for joining us, man. Thanks very much.